What if I told you that one of the most destructive lies ever told about Africa began with a misread Bible verse, was weaponized by colonizers, and ended in nearly 1 million African people being slaughtered in just 100 days? A lie that was used to justify slavery, colonialism, and even genocide. This is the story of the Hamitic hypothesis, a racist theory that shaped how the world viewed Africa, distorted how Africans viewed themselves, and justified everything from slavery to genocide. By the end of this episode, you will understand what the Hamitic theory actually says, where it came from and why it was created, how the Bible was misused to justify slavery and white supremacy, and how this myth directly contributed to the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. My name is I share my journey of leaving behind Germany to travel the African continent full-time together with my 2 children and eventually start a new life here in Nairobi, Kenya. I am a cultural anthropologist and historian in African studies, which is why whenever I travel or explore new places here on the African continent, I put a special focus on the history, the culture, the socio-political realities of the people on the ground, which I love to share with my audience. And today's topic is very important to me personally, because since I can think, and also in the comment sections under some of my videos that deal with identity and blackness, I have repeatedly been confronted with the claim that the Habesha people of northern Ethiopia and Eritrea aren't truly African, but instead are considered by many people as Arabs, as not indigenous to the Horn of Africa. Some people even go as far as to claim that Habesha people are the descendants of colonizers. And my jaw literally dropped when I first heard about the Hamitic theory and how this racist theory directly contributed to the killing of 1 million innocent people during the Rwandan genocide in 1994, this terrible, dark, and painful part of our modern African history was just commemorated 2 days ago. So I believe now it's the perfect time to speak about, or let me say, to educate my African brothers and sisters on the continent and worldwide about this racist lie, because unfortunately I've seen so many people who have internalized this racist lie, which was designed to divide us. So let's begin with the question, where did this idea come from? It begins with the biblical story of Noah in the book of Genesis chapter 9. After the flood, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And later interpretations claimed that Japheth is the ancestor of the Caucasian race, while the descendants of Shem settled in the Middle East and became speakers of what we now call Semitic languages, which is a legitimate linguistic classification that includes languages like Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Ge'ez, which is the forefather of languages like Amharic, Tigrinya, and Ge'ez nowadays is not spoken outside of the church. It's the liturgical language that the priests use. However, it's very important to understand, because I've heard so many people referring to Habesha people and Arabic people as the so-called Semitic people. The term Semitic refers to a language family and not a race. However, during the 19th century, European race theorists distorted the term, turning it into a so-called racial category and falsely classifying Arabs and Jews as a distinctive Semitic race in a hierarchy below Europeans but above Black Africans. And it was within this framework that Ham's descendants, who were associated with Black Africans, were placed at the bottom. And mind you, this racial pseudoscience had no basis whatsoever in genetics, in anthropology, or in scripture, but it profoundly shaped colonial thinking. And all of this goes back to a particular part in the Genesis story. So back in the Genesis story, after Noah becomes drunk and lies naked in his tent, Ham sees his father's nakedness, tells his brothers, who then respectfully cover him. And then when Noah wakes up, he curses Canaan, Ham's son, saying, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." The Bible says nothing about skin color, race, or Africa. Yet in later centuries, this particular paragraph was twisted to claim that Black people were descendants of Ham and divinely destined for slavery. This became known as the Curse of Ham, and starting in the 15th century, it was used to justify the transatlantic slave trade, falsely portraying blackness as a sign of divine punishment and legitimizing centuries of racial oppression. Fast forward, in the 19th century, European scholars and explorers revived this biblical myth with pseudoscientific language. They invented the Hamitic hypothesis, the idea that everything of value in what they classified as sub-Saharan Africa had come from a superior Caucasoid race called the Hamites, who had supposedly migrated from the Middle East into Africa. And their theory basically claimed that civilizations such as Egypt, Nubia, Aksum, and Greater Zimbabwe could not have been built by Black Africans. Instead, they believed that these civilizations were built by lighter-skinned foreign Hamites, which were linked to Semites or even Europeans. And the most famous promoter of this racist theory was John Hanning Speke, a British explorer who claimed that in every region of Africa where there is any semblance of civilization, one finds the Hamites, superior in every way to the Negro. And again, this theory was never scientific. It was designed to deny African agency, justify colonial rule, and divide African communities by appearance and language. And when I look at it today and consider all these comments about Habesha's supposed Arab background and them being the children of colonizers, invaders, and not truly indigenous to Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa in general, then I think to myself, it worked. Influenced by slavery, colonialism, and the rise of racial pseudoscience, European anthropologists reinvented and reimagined the Hamitic lineage to preserve white supremacist hierarchies. And in their colonial fantasy, the so-called Hamites were reimagined as a superior branch of Africans, often described as Caucasoid or Eurasian in origin. And these included certain Ethiopian groups, Somalis, Tutsis, Fulani, Berbers, what have you, groups that were seen as lighter-skinned and more refined. The same European pseudoscientists also claimed that the Negroid populations in Africa were either pre-Adamic, meaning not descendant from Noah at all, or a result of mixing between the so-called Hamites and what they perceived as the primitive locals. Some of them even went as far as to claim that the Negroid populations are a completely separate and inferior human species. And imagine this was a view that was echoed by so many renowned scientists of that time that are still being celebrated in Western textbooks for their related works in genetics, in biology, you name it. In short, while the Bible saw all humanity as descended from Noah, 19th century European race theory broke that theological unity to invent biological racial hierarchies. Next, let's look at how the Hamitic theory divided Africans. Colonial administrators in East and Central Africa used the Hamitic theory to divide and rule, not just by redrawing borders or controlling economies, but by reprogramming identity itself. Those with lighter skin, narrower features, or taller stature were labeled Hamites, believed to be of Caucasoid origin and therefore more civilized, more intelligent, and more fit to lead. And because of this racist belief, these groups were given preferential access to education, to governance, and economic opportunities. Meanwhile, their darker-skinned neighbors, labeled Bantu or Negroid, were portrayed as inherently inferior, as less capable, and therefore more suited for physical labor and subservience. Mind you, this wasn't just a social attitude, it was deeply institutional. In Rwanda, for instance, colonial administrators issued ethnic identity cards that fixed the people into rigid racial categories, Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. Another great example is Ethiopia, where European scholars and Orientalist narratives imposed a false racial binary between the Semitic-speaking highlanders that include groups like the Tigrayans, Amhara, Gurage, and Nilotic and Cushitic-speaking southern populations, inventing and reinforcing hierarchies that were not rooted in indigenous culture, but simply in colonial colonial imagination, but the damage did not end in colonial policies. Sadly, and this must be said, the Hamitic theory instilled a false sense of superiority among some of those labeled as Hamites. I know it sounds ridiculous, but unfortunately there are so many Africans who have internalized the idea that they were more closer to Europeans, culturally, racially, and even spiritually. Over time, this led to ingrained classicism, colorism, and ethnic chauvinism, dynamics that still shape the media, politics, and ethnic relationships today. We see this in Ethiopia, where narratives about civilized Highlanders versus primitive Southerners, narratives that were supported and reinforced by international institutions such as UNESCO, persist up to this day, but not as facts, but as unspoken assumptions passed down through generations. But sadly, we see this also on the flip side in viral online discourses, where people now question whether lighter-skinned Ethiopians, the so-called Habeshas, are really African, or some people even accuse them as being foreign settlers and the descendants of colonizers. And I'm sorry to disappoint you, but this too is a direct echo of the Hamitic theory, just inverted, because it still relies on the same colonial logic where phenotype equals belonging and complexion determines authenticity. And what many people don't realize is this: as we try to reclaim our histories, many of us are still operating inside the frameworks that were designed to divide us. Now, the Hamitic theory may be debunked in academic journals and in universities, but I'm telling you, it still lives rent-free in so many of our minds, and it's alive in how we talk about each other, in how we assign belonging, and in how we question each other's roots. Some still see themselves as more civilized and more advanced or more original than others, not because of history, but because of a lie that was planted into the minds of our ancestors to keep us fragmented. The idea behind the Hamitic theory eventually fell apart thanks to better research and real science. One big moment happened in 1974 when historians and experts from all around the world met at a UNESCO conference in Cairo, and they made it clear ancient civilizations like Egypt, Nubia, and Aksum were not created by outsiders. They were built by Africans and on African soil. Around the same time, scientists studying DNA started finding something incredible. Africa has the most genetically diverse people in the world. That means that all kinds of physical traits, languages, and cultures developed naturally in Africa, not because people from the Middle East or Europe brought them. The whole idea of a special Hamitic race turned out to be completely made up. Just another racist theory used to deny African people credit for their own achievements. Today, real historians and real scientists see the Hamitic theory the same way we see flat earth theories: outdated, false, and based on bias, not facts. Last but not least, I want to talk about how the Hamitic theory has directly contributed to the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Nowhere, and I repeat nowhere, has the Hamitic myth caused more destruction and suffering than in Rwanda. The seeds of division were initially planted during German colonial rule, which began in the late 19th century. Influenced by the Hamitic theory, the German colonial administrators believed that the Tutsi elite, who were taller and who were believed to have more European-like features, were descendants of the Hamites and therefore more intelligent and more capable than the Hutu majority. This racist idea shaped how they governed the colony. But after Germany lost all its colonies following World War I, Belgium took control. And they took the racial hierarchy to another level because they enforced the Hamitic myth as official policy. They gave Tutsis better access to education, leadership roles, and positions in the administration and church, while Hutus were pushed into farming and labor. And to make this racial divide permanent, they introduced ethnic identity cards in the 1930s, forcing every Rwandan to be labeled as either Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. And mind you, these categories, they were never ethnic groups. In fact, Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa were different social classes, and the borders of these categories, they were never static, but they were fluent, which means that a Hutu could become a Tutsi and vice versa. All these groups shared the same language and belief. So they are, by definition, not ethnic groups. However, because of the Hamitic myth being enforced as official policy, a so-called ethnicization of these categories happened over time. And of course, this system created deep resentment and laid the foundation for decades of tensions. After Rwanda gained independence in 1962, the Hutu elites flipped the script. They used the same Hamitic narrative to portray the Tutsis not as superior, but as foreign invaders who had oppressed the true Rwandans and needed to be removed. And this dangerous belief exploded in 1994 when government forces and militias carried out a genocide targeting the Tutsi population. Imagine, in just 100 days, an estimated 800,000 people, innocent people, were murdered, many by their own neighbors, with machetes and small arms. And moderate Hutus who opposed the killings were also slaughtered. And all of it, the hate, the violence, and the fear, was fueled by a colonial lie, a racial myth invented in Europe, enforced in Africa, and internalized by its victims. The Hamitic hypothesis may be dead in Western textbooks and academic journals, but it still lives in our conversations and in so many of our people's minds. And fam, it's time we bury it for good, not just as a lie, but as the weapon of mass division that it was. Africa has never needed outsiders to explain its brilliance. We built civilizations on our own terms. We are not a people without history. We are a people whose history was distorted. But these times are over now. Let's make these things clear, please. Skin color is not a measure of worth. European myths are not African truth. And no colonial fantasy will ever define who we are. The Hamitic theory didn't just divide us, it justified slavery, colonialism, and even genocide. But now we hold the pen, we write the future, and that future begins with historical clarity and radical self-love. So let's teach this history in our homes, our schools, our art, and our platforms. Let's decolonize our language, our beauty standards, and our sense of belonging. And let's reclaim the full, unfiltered truth of who we are. Because when we know who we are, no one, and I repeat, no one, can tell us who we are not. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something new, found some value in it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue this discussion respectfully. Each one teach one, and I look forward to see you in the next video. Bye.